Hear that? Holy crap. I'm pretty sure that's a Bigfoot. Let me tell you a story. Welcome to Season 2. Welcome to another Season 2 episode of Bigfoot Campfire Stories. This encounter comes from my birth state of Pennsylvania and the Appalachian Mountains. Three friends, Tim, Barry, and Martin, were on an overnight camp out in the Elk State Forest, and it led them into a chance encounter unlike most I have never heard before. Let's hear their story. Well, I got a call from a couple of pals of mine, Tim and Barry. They had planned a day hike in the Elk State Forest. It wasn't very far of a drive, but about 2 hours, and we had heard that Bigfoot had been seen in the past in this area. See, me and my buddies like to venture out into places that Bigfoot reports come in from, not so much to research anything, but to see if we're brave enough to go there and sometimes stay the night. Tim had heard that the story had just come out of this area, and since none of us had been there before, we decided a simple overnight trip should be enough to get a feel for the place. We had been on many of these adventures together, and have yet to find a place scary enough to keep us away. Yet that wasn't until this trip. Well, since Barry had the Toyota Dolphin all fixed up, it was great for these types of trips. Picture an old Toyota pickup truck. Now picture that truck with a mini Winnebago on the back of it. So tiny the three of us can't be in it and turn around at the same time, but a nice dry place to hang out if it rains, and a nice hard cover when we sleep. Anyhow, we set plans for the weekend to start out early. I couldn't believe it, but Barry was at my door at 4:30 in the morning. He and Tim were bright-eyed and ready to go, so I tossed my gear and got in the back of the Dolphin since there were only 2 seats up front. There was a window in the back that opened up into the cab so we could talk. We could talk all the way to the forest. Well, sure enough, just after a couple of hours, we were entering the forest just as the sun was coming up behind us. It seemed to be trailing right behind us as we reached the top of the ridge where Barry had planned to park us. It was at the T of 3 roads and seemed to be a good place, unlikely to be forgotten, as all roads should actually lead back to the camper. Well, we piled out of the Toyota and headed right into the bushes to mark our territory. It was like a ritual. We'd split off on 3 different directions to pee on the bushes as a sign to the animals that the big dogs had arrived, and usually it works. We hadn't been bothered much by animals at all. Well, we unpacked our other gear and sat the camp chairs out and rolled out the awning and tied it down. The weekend was about to start. Tim grabbed out some eggs and bacon, sausage, cooked it all up right there on the Coleman stove as our ritual continued. This seemed to be just like every other trip we had taken. As we sat and ate, Tim brought out the forest map he had. He'd been looking for the Bigfoot sighting. Just a few weeks ago, he pointed it out on the map where the location had been found. It was just down over the ridge we had parked ourselves on. He had talked to one of the guys that saw the Bigfoot and even met him for a beer. He circled on the map right exactly where they had been hiking when they came across it. The spot was a good 5-mile hike from where our spot was, but no roads actually go there, as it was a valley in between 2 ridge roads that led down into a lake in the back. All of us being strong hikers, it shouldn't be an issue. A couple of hours in and a few hours out, we should be back before dinner. Well, Barry wrote a note and left it at the camper as to where we were headed with the date, the time, and our expected return time, so if the ranger comes by, he'll at least know what the intended plan was. And we geared up for the hike and headed down off the ridge towards the valley. At first it wasn't bad at all, a slow descent into a pine bottom, but after the first mile or so it started to get a little hairy. Not so much that it kept us out, but most smart people would have reached the first 12-foot rock face and turned back rather than anchoring a rope and dropping to see how much further we could go. Well, that was the last serious drop, but the closer we got to the bottom of the valley, the thicker all the trees and the shrubs got, as people definitely rarely come in here. The guys that had come in this deep and seen the Bigfoot had actually shot a deer and had it run down the ridge and into the valley below, so they followed it, noting the same as we did that humans seem to rarely, if ever, get into this far back off the road. We couldn't even see the road or the ridge for that matter, Anymore, the forest had gotten so thick it seemed to just fade away until we got to the opening of a giant meadow. Now, Tim had guessed we had to be close to that guy's where they had said they had seen the creature going back into the tree line from the lake that we still hadn't found. Barry climbed up one of the last trees and had gotten up a good 40 feet, and he yelled down that he could see the lake, and it was a few hundred yards further back the meadow, so down he came, crashing like a black bear to the ground once again. We continued back to find the hidden lake, and sure enough, about 500 yards ahead, it was a perfect shallow spring-fed lake. We noticed that there was an abundance of small fish, frogs, all sort of critters moving about the water, and yet it seemed clean enough to drink out of. Across the 2-acre lake, we could see where deer must be laying down at night as the grasses were all pushed down, so we walked over there to inspect it. But when we got close, we started to notice just how big those lay marks actually were. And not only the marks were huge, too big to be a whitetail or even black bear for that matter. And there were piles of matted grasses as if they were actual beds of some sort. And it had a sweet smell of that decay, meaning that they had been laying there for quite some time. Well, I started to notice some impressions going in and out of the area heading towards the tree line, so I started to follow them. Barry and Tim in tow behind me. The closer we got to the tree line, the more the ground turned into dirt, and the impressions became footprints. Bare, man-like footprints, to be specific. Well, Tim broke out his camera and laid his measuring markers about a couple of the tracks, and he began to take pictures of them. They seemed to run about 16 inches long and near 8 inches wide, and a weird bump on the outside of the foot near the front pad. Well, the ground was very hard, so they weren't very deep, but we did try to cast those tracks in place. Tim mixed up some plaster and Paris and poured it into 3 of the tracks, but much of the day had gone by, and taking pictures of the grass beds and noting the orientation of the lay spots, it seemed that they were lined up nearly perfectly west to east, but not knowing which side was the actual head. Well, we must have spent 3 hours more than we intended to do everything we could to document the find. None of us ever thought we would find anything, but sure enough, here was the evidence right in front of us. Well, finally, I called it, and I told the guys we had no choice but to start back, as we'd really be chasing the daylight as it was. Tim had gotten the map back out and showed us where there was another road where we were parked near, took a bend around the wood line where we were standing, so it was easier to go out that way than the way we came in, so we agreed to give that our best shot. After about 2 hours, we noticed that there was absolutely no animal activity going on around us. Tim had mentioned that the shadows got longer, that he really felt like someone or something was watching us. Barry broke out the GPS, and sure enough, we were only about a half a mile from the road up ahead, so we rested up, drank some water, and planned the rest of the hike out. Well, Barry had set off ahead of us a bit, and Tim and I were trying to make up those 300 yards. Sure enough, Barry had reached the road on the ridge and was standing at the top, watching us up the trail behind him. Well, I noticed him starting to wave his hand, so I started waving back like a dick. We were about 100 yards from him when Tim and I heard the first strange whoop come up from behind us. Well, the sun had tucked in behind the ridge, and it was really starting to get dark on us fast. With that strange call, it lit a fire under Tim and I, and we made haste to reach the top with Barry. Once we were there, he told us that there was something behind us trailing us in the wood line. He could see a shadowy, dark figure paralleling us, and then we all heard the loud whoop, and it ran off in another direction and was gone from sight. And we had all decided that this was enough for one day. We nearly power walked all the way back to the camper. He lit the place up like energy was free, started a nice campfire, and started to really think about what had just happened. Tim had taken out his camera and started to review some of the pictures on the LED screen. No, it wasn't very big, but a pretty good feel for what we had found. It really began to sink in the type of evidence that we had collected. Tim had taken the cast back out of his pack, and they were still pretty dirty and quite thick. In fact, one of them had broken in half on the hike back, so he set them aside to dry overnight. Barry had rounded up some great food, and we sat around eating brats and all kind of camp food until, well, it felt like we were about to explode, to be honest. It was about 11 p.m. that night when we heard the first coyote howl. We heard so many packs over the trips that we used to mimic them and howled right back at them. They seemed to go off about every 15 minutes, and as we howled back each time, the pack sounded as if they were actually getting right on top of us. Then it didn't seem so funny, so we sat silent until we heard the deep, dark coyote howl come from over the ridge that we had dropped down over this morning going into the valley. It seemed to be just some 40 yards away. Well, I grabbed my big mag light and Barry his torch, and we went over to see if we could find anything to go with that howl, but it was dead silent again. Not even coyotes were howling. Now just dead, total silence. Well, I guess it was about 1 a.m. when we all just had finally had enough excitement and figured out the sleeping arrangements with rock, paper, scissors, and, well, poor Tim lost this round. See, the camper has a full mattress for the owner, King Barry, and there's a small dinette set that turns into a twin, and we toss a pan on the floor for the loser. And Tim's rock got wrapped in my paper this round. We figured we'd crash out until sunup and arrive back home before lunch. A couple of hours into our slumber, we were all awakened by a really strange noise. Something was rattling our stuff outside the camper. I was the only one with a window view, so I poked my head up and took a look. Sure enough, there was a large black-furred animal eating the grease and bits we had left out near the campfire. Well, Barry jumped down off of the top, and the noise alone scared off whatever it was. You could hear it run away. So we put the seating area back up and went outside to check on the mess. Sure enough, all of Tim's casts were now crushed into little tiny pieces of plaster all over the place, and the hot dog rolls were MIA as well. It must have been a bear lumbering about. God, what a shame the casts were destroyed. Well, just as we could see the sun starting to peek up from the east once more, we started to load all of our gear back into the camper. Tim hadn't been much help, as all of a sudden he couldn't find his camera anywhere at all. We'd even pulled everything back out of the camper and checked through it all once more, and it just wasn't there. Finally, we decided it had to be in the gear somewhere, and we decided to just take our last territory marking and head back to the city. Well, Barry and I were standing at the camper ready to go, and all of a sudden we could hear Tim calling us over near the ridgeline where he had went to empty his bladder. Now, when we got to him, sure enough, right there on the other side of the road was his camera, smashed to bits on the ground with what seemed to be like a 16 by 8 footprint right on top of it. Well, at that point, there was no doubt what had visited our camp that night. It took the only thing that could have proven our story and destroyed it. All the ride home, Tim tried to get the SIM card to register in his laptop, but no matter what he tried, it was just too far gone. The guys had dropped me at home with a plan to return to the area in 2 weeks' time, but when the time came, none of us were really willing to go and stay the night again. We'd finally found a location we didn't need to go back to ever again. Well, these three men loved the idea of Bigfoot hunting until Bigfoot actually showed up and goes from myth to reality. Thanks for listening. I'm Reverend Jeff, and may the Squatch be with you.